Welcome to Nasdaq TradeTalks, where we meet with the top thought leaders and strategists in emerging technologies, digital assets, the regulatory landscape, and capital markets. I'm your host, Jill Malandrino, and joining me this afternoon, we have Kyle Walter, Global Head of Investigative Research at Logically, and Jordan Kraft, Partner and Chief Strategy Officer at Mercury Analytics. We're here to discuss the potential for mis- and disinformation to impact financial markets and why private industry, federal governments, and local officials need to work together to combat these harms in a comprehensive manner. It is great to have the both of you with us. And Kyle, let's kick it off here. What quantifies as misinformation? Where is it derived from?
Sure. Thanks for having me, Jill. I think misinformation is best described as inaccurate or otherwise misleading information, right? So if information is shared without broader context or without providing broader sourcing, it can sometimes be misinterpreted and it can potentially lead to online harms or even offline harms.
So what's the impact of misinformation in the financial markets?
Sure. I mean, obviously, right now is kind of a serendipitous time to be talking about misinformation and financial markets. If you look at things like some of the runs on AMC, GameStop, also in the cryptocurrency markets as well, there's a lot of online coordination and sometimes misleading information that's shared in relation to potential for profits that can be earned off of these different assets that I think plays pretty significantly into where we see misinformation impacting financial markets at the moment.
Right. So, Jordan, is there enough oversight and framework in place to help mitigate misinformation?
Well, what we find when we're working with corporates and C-suite executives to be monitoring these sorts of mis and disinformation that can negatively impact all of the stock price, the actual consumer behaviors, consumer perceptions. There are a lot of different ways that CEOs are looking for information on this. And, unfortunately, there's not enough. There's always emerging ways that we're looking to in order to, source this information. But, beyond just looking to technology, looking to monitoring, you have to keep innovating in order to keep up with all the information that's out there.
Yeah, I think that's a great point that you make, Jordan, because, perhaps even 5-10 years ago, if you send out a tweet, that potentially move a market, whether it's finance or otherwise. Now it's so complex because there's that video and sound component. So it's like when we talk about these new technologies, such as AI as an example, making the world more efficient and so forth, there's also bad actors that are employing the same technology to execute on this misinformation. It's almost like a double-edged sword.
Yeah, and there's the thing about AI is that not only can it be the source of misinformation and disinformation, but C-suite is also looking to utilize AI in order to make their processes more efficient and to get in and really find ways that will be faster than a human could ever figure out how to source the information, where it's coming from, how it's coming. And then, take that up to the decision makers. And that's where they have to figure out what kinds of threats to address, what kind of misinformation to redirect and to do something about. And Kyle, I think, you have a lot of information on how people are going about doing that in their corporations.
Yeah, sure. Exactly. I think, you kind of hit the nail on the head that one of the key things that needs to be done, and one of the things that we're employing at Logically, is utilizing AI to fight AI, right? So the idea of developing AI modeling that can be used to combat these different technologies that are at times, you pointed it out, Jill, they're being used for positive things, but they're also being manipulated by bad actors as well. So developing technological solutions that incorporate AI to be able to combat the misuses of AI, I think, is a very critical thing that we're all trying to work toward right now.
Right. And Kyle, outside of what's happening within the financial markets, of course, we have a number of elections, particularly that in the US, where misinformation is certainly going to be part of the calculus, right? It's just something that we need to face. So as a consumer of news, someone such as myself, how do you identify misinformation? Do you have to make the concerted effort to get yourself out of certain echo chambers or think twice when you see something hit your feed? I mean, how these deep fakes, particularly the video ones, are, you have to be an expert to be able to analyze this.
Yeah, for sure. I think particularly when it comes to multimodal generative AI, that's a very difficult problem at the moment, being able to discern, specifically when it comes to things like generative audio or generative video. They're very difficult to actually identify whether or not they're fake most of the time, particularly audio in this instance. But I think when it comes to being a consumer or being somebody that's just a general civic participant in the electoral process, right? It's hard to say, but you need to take more time. I think time is the critical thing here. You have to have the time and the space to be able to assess the sources that you're looking at. It also helps to have a verified set of sources that you're looking to, that you know that you can trust, that you know are always providing you with good information. Taking that kind of due diligence and that preemptive time and effort to make sure that you're getting good information, I think, is the biggest defense against potentially falling victim to mis or disinformation.
Right. So Jordan, let's talk about some of those preventative measures and solutions that are available, whether it's on the corporate side or for the consumer.
Yeah, I mean, really, in order to understand the level of threat and what kind of information is out there, going direct to consumers is often, your best bet as a brand, as government, just to see, okay, what information is really impacting people's decisions, their perceptions, the way that they're going about their lives. And that helps to understand what sort of response you should prepare for that. And a lot of times you'll identify a threat that, yes, it's wrong, it's misinformation, it's disinformation, but is it harmful? And it's sort of making those decisions because you only have a limited set of resources in order to combat those. So really, it's monitoring, and it's having a team in place who's able to make quick decisions on what we should be addressing and what we should let rest and move on and focus our energy elsewhere.
I think part of the challenge is whether misinformation is identified or not. Once that seed has been planted, it's really hard to reverse course or alter your course once it's out there, right? Especially in an environment, whether it's related to the elections or not. Once a narrative is in place, it's really hard to put that critical mindset into place. And I think that's a challenge, not just for the average citizen or the consumer of news, but this needs to be something gets resolved from the top down. It's almost there's just a vacuum of leadership when it comes to that, whether it's from security companies that are providing this technology to combat it, whether it's from government resources, but it seems as if there's almost a vacuum at the top for us to reverse course, and once the seed is planted, to be a little bit more critical about it.
Yeah, for sure. Look, I think there's a handful of steps. Oops, sorry, Jordan.
Kyle, go ahead, and then Jordan, I'll help you follow up.
Sure. Yeah, I think there's a handful of steps that are required, right, to actually address the problem. I think you kind of nailed it, right? There's the identification stage, which requires technology, but then there's also the more coordinated level from different levels of stakeholders, whether it's at a federal government or kind of at an NGO level or in the private sector. And we do see, a vacuum in some capacities of people willing to address the problem. That's not the case all over the world, but it is the case in some places, right? And I think just more comprehensive engagement between different levels of stakeholders is absolutely necessary, right? Because we can't solve this on our own. Nobody can solve it on their own. It's a very kind of systemic societal problem that's permeated a lot of different areas of just day-to-day life. So having everybody coordinated on the same level, communicating kind of appropriately, that's really, really important. And it's something that we're missing significantly right now.
And Jordan?
In our studies, we've looked at people who are concerned with brand reputation, from upper management to middle management, and you really do see a difference of approach between levels of management. So when you say a vacuum at the top, it's not necessarily that there's so much of a vacuum. They're the ones who are much more concerned, broadly speaking, in terms of how different modes of social media and media in general are impacting their brand perception. The lower management seems to be more on a level where they're putting out fires. They're the ones who are on the front lines, and working back up to the upper level management, who really, we see a high degree of engagement and a much higher level of concern about mis and disinformation from the upper management. It's just, what do you do with that information once you have it, and how do you put out those fires once they've started?
Right. And I appreciate that clarification. When I meant vacuum, I meant it more from a civic perspective. But let's stay on the civic perspective for a moment here, because there are other regions globally that are working or have worked to put frameworks in place, around artificial intelligence and also around mis and disinformation. Why have they been successful being able to do so? Of course, everyone's legislative process is different. And is there anything that U.S. regulators and legislators can take as a model from other regions that have put some of a framework in place?
Sure, yeah. I think there are obviously some places that are addressing these issues right now. I think the EU is a great place to look at that has taken initial steps, right, to address things from a content moderation perspective, but also, to your point, from an AI perspective. I think obviously there are local regulations that require significant attention, that require people to take different considerations into account when they're crafting legislation. I think from a US perspective, we have to just generally reconcile with the fact that there are bad actors, and a lot of those bad actors are abroad, right? So the idea that there are foreign actors trying to influence the election, which is something that we've been talking about for, at this point, 8 years now, more actively, right? It's been going on for longer than that, but we've most actively talked about it for the last 2 elections. That's something that we need to address. It's something we need to try to incorporate into our own legislation. Other than that, again, it's mostly about engaging both with the public, but also with legislators, right? Understanding from a legislative perspective that we need to address the problem, but also making sure that the public understands that there is a clear threat that is existing, that there is something that needs to be addressed so that they have more buy-in from the public more broadly.
Right. So, Jordan, it doesn't sound like this is a one-size-fits-all solution.
Yes, and that's why, AI is expanding and changing and growing, and we have to do that alongside all the technology that's out there. So there has to be an approach that incorporates a multi-method approach in so much as using your technology, using your brain trust in your C-suite, in your full organization, and also just monitoring, using outside sources of information that you have to have a pulse on for every moment.
So, Kyle, is there any way to quantify the amount of messages out there that count as misinformation? How could you contextualize that?
Yeah, it's very difficult to quantify the total volume of mis or disinformation, right? It can sometimes number hundreds of millions of pieces of content across the internet. I do think that we have seen overall on a time-to-time basis, right, that the volume of mis and disinformation that we track is definitely increasing. I would say the topics that it covers also is increasing. So it's difficult to put a specific number to it, but I would say that we have definitely seen more in the last, let's say, 5 years than ever before.
Right. And to wrap up here, I'm going to ask the both of you this. So, Kyle, what types of solutions is your company providing in this fight against misinformation?
Sure. Yeah. So we're working on a variety of technological solutions. We actually just announced one today, which is specifically geared toward helping fact checkers have a more streamlined process when it comes to fact checking video content. But we're also working on solutions for trust and safety teams when it comes to having kind of a cross-platform view of different pieces of content that are disseminating across the internet. And we're also looking at understanding things like coordination in authentic account behavior. So we're really providing a variety of different solutions to address a variety of different problems, because as I've said, this problem space has significant layers to it, and there's not kind of one solution. It requires a large suite of solutions to be able to address the problem.
And Jordan, I'll ask you the same thing to wrap up.
Sure. We work directly with PR and communications professionals, and oftentimes direct with brands to understand what their consumers are, how they're reacting to certain news, messages, media, any number of things. And we will help teams to understand, first, the threat. Secondly, is it even a threat worth addressing? And thirdly, just understand how they can create a strategy to put the fire out, if that's the case.
All right. Appreciate the both of you and your insight. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jill.